member states and water companies start freaking out. We made regulation, but we're going to be in breach if we try to enforce it. And then basically the EU Commission decided to cover up the issue instead of addressing it.
Follow the money.
This is the podcast of the European investigative newsroom Follow the Money. In each edition, we talk about a recent investigation exposing Europe's power brokers, from corrupt politicians and shady lobbyists to mysterious oligarchs and financial fraudsters. I'm your host, Emma Duchatinier, and as always, I'm joined by Alexander Fanta in Vienna. Good morning,
Hello.
Alex.
Hi, good morning.
In today's episode, we're talking about something that's found in our bread and in bottles of wine, and as a result of that, in every person's body, forever chemicals. Alex, apparently in Austria, this was also found in bread, in cereals. Has it been a big topic there?
To be honest, it's the first thing I hear about it. So, I mean, obviously, I think, I, like a lot of people, I'm fastly approaching middle age. I'm watching carefully what I put into my body. Only buy organic food, make a really conscious choice about what I eat and drink. But still, this is not a story that I have come across at all. And it feels a bit like maybe we're not talking enough about, forever chemicals and their impact on our environment and ourselves.
Today, we are joined by journalist, writer, and physicist Thomas Gordon, who discovered how the EU seems to be disregarding the alarming levels of one of those forever chemicals, which is TFA. Welcome, Thomas.
Hi, good morning.
So, a lot of titles. What would you say you're foremost?
Well, at the moment, since last October, I am full-time investigative journalist, and I'm very happy with that. It really matches up with what I was doing anyway. Before that, a lot of people would describe me as an activist or other things. I'm just doing journalism now. But I do have like a very, very large background with the environmental cases and with PFAS specifically.
Which is a topic you feel very strongly about. Is that correct?
Well, to be honest, I was kind of like Alexander in 2021. Actually, earlier than that, in 2019, I think a friend of mine mentioned PFAS for the first time, and I had the same reaction. I was like, what is that? I'd never heard of it. And I think that's a very common feeling. What changed for me, at least, is that I stumbled into a scandal in Belgium in 2021. And then I got more and more and more invested in this story, really. And so that's, I'm not particularly obsessed with chemical pollution necessarily, but PFAS is, it has an air of scandal around it all the time. And there's a lot of lobbying, a lot of science manipulation. And that really got my focus.
These forever chemicals, we keep hearing that they are everywhere and they're in the water, that they're in the food we're eating. But still, how dangerous are they really?
So the basic idea about PFAS is that you're trying to create an indestructible molecule. That's how it was originally found. They had to make a material that was resistant to uranium. Actually, they needed for the atom bomb production. And so they created this type of plastic, actually, Teflon. That is extremely resistant to chemicals, to heat, to all kinds of things. But actually it's a plastic. And so you might wonder, like, how do they do that? Well, the basic way they do that is by, putting fluor inside of the plastic. And this makes them incredibly strong, or much stronger actually than the original version of it. And so you get oils that are heat resistant. You get plastic that is heat and chemical resistant. You get gases that you can use to cool things, and you get more effective pesticides. And so this idea of these molecules being stronger and more inert and resistant to all kinds of things gives them properties that are truly almost miraculous, to be honest. Like, if you were a scientist in that day and you discovered this thing, you'd be like, I mean, your mind would be blown. And now, they're in our blood. They're everywhere.
So when I'm like drinking a glass of water, is that harming my body essentially?
Over time, that's the other thing. From the toxicological perspective, there's surprisingly little sometimes that we know about it. We know that it really interferes with some critical aspects of our bodies, like immunity and hormones. This is not an acute toxic substance at all. Like, even if you take a glass of it, you're not going to die immediately. It takes a long, long time. Some of them also build up in your body, and then over time, there's a good chance there will be some kind of effect. But it's so difficult to point to a specific thing. The problem is our biological systems can't really deal with it. They can't break down the flora, and so it becomes kind of a blocking thing. And also, this is also the reason why they added to pesticides, is to make the pesticide more resistant to organic breakdown, for instance.
So that's the reason we call them forever chemicals, I'm guessing.
Exactly. I was just going to say, Emma, that's great. So that's why they're forever chemicals, because they can last for hundreds of years. That's what a lot of people don't understand about this. When you look at ground pollution, let's say you look at maybe more well-known thing is like nitrogen, a fertilizer. Fertilizer is like a molecule that can actually be absorbed biologically over time. With forever chemicals, forget about it. Like it's there. It's going to stay in the background. You actually ingest it. You lose it in the toilet again. It goes into the water cycle, and it just comes back to you. We're basically adding these forever chemicals to the background pollution of our environment, and we'll never get rid of them. It's physically impossible to get them out.
Back to 2020, when the EU had plans to regulate these forever chemicals in our drinking water. The idea was to make our drinking water safer and cleaner. But then what happened?
Yeah, so as you say, they put a parameter in. You can say like how much lead can be in your water and this and that. All these parameters are listed in this table. And one of them they introduced was for all PFAS together. There was like a threshold. So there could only be 500 nanograms of liter. It doesn't really matter what the number is, but so much for PFAS in water. Now, a couple of years later, they had to figure out like how to measure it. They still needed the technical guidelines for it. And during that process, member states actually start saying, yeah, but, actually, we found this one PFAS, TFA. And, if that's included in that parameter, it's going to be in breach. TFA alone will have values as 4, 5, 6, maybe 10 times more than was the regulatory limit. And so all these member states and water companies start freaking out. And they start saying like, okay, this is bad. We made regulation, but we're going to be in breach if we try to enforce it. And then, basically the EU Commission, decided to, cover up the issue instead of addressing it. So basically they've started suggesting that TFA wasn't a PFAS. They started, kind of like introducing these weird calculations. They started really, erasing things in the technical guidelines. They started putting ideas in there that came from the industry. And basically they tried to make the TFA problem go away without actually addressing the TFA problem.
How is it possible that up until that moment, TFA had pretty much fallen off the radar?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And that's actually something I was wondering about 2 years ago. Basically, TFA is a breakdown product of a lot of things, but also of certain gases, cooling gases. And these gases are actually a replacement for gases that cause the hole in the ozone layer. It's mind-blowing to think about it, but when they discovered the hole in the ozone layer, the industry said, oh, well, that's bad. We'll replace them by F gases, fluoride-based gases. At the core of it, the main effect of these gases was the production of TFA. So it would rain down as TFA and go into the oceans. And then they made all these, scientific reports basically saying TFA is not a problem, not toxicologically. The concentrations are not a problem, blah, 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 blah. And then it really disappeared from the radar. So none of these companies had a TFA emission permit, for instance. It wasn't being monitored. There was no regulation against it. But the weird thing is, like, the industry was measuring TFA in the 90s. So even the techniques to measure it kind of got lost, which is completely mind-blowing. And then it reappeared. And the more we looked for it, the more we found, and the more we discovered that it's actually in the environment in way higher quantities than anybody could ever imagine. And that turns out not to have been caused by the F gases. They certainly contribute, but by pesticides. So that's how, this whole thing becomes a huge mess.
Surely when the EU is making these regulations to make our drinking water safer, I would assume they're basing themselves on scientific evidence, right?
No. I mean, I have to be very, very straight with you. Even the thresholds that they use are industry manipulated. It's a rough thing to say, but it's very clear that even the levels that is currently, let's say the other because there's two PFAS parameters. But if you look at the other one, it's like 100 nanograms. Well, where does that come from? Well, it's what the industry wanted. It's not based on a toxicological screening of PFAS. And in fact, we know from more recent studies that it doesn't protect us well enough. So the issue is that if you were to take more modern toxicological knowledge about PFAS and apply it, then suddenly drinking water is not drinkable anymore. So you come in this situation where the government actually has to abandon this idea of health-based values, and they come up with these things of like, yeah, we'll do health-based, but also consider the economic impact. It's you see it happening in a lot of cases. But basically, they've completely messed it up. Like we were supposed to be protected against stuff like this, but we weren't. And the levels that we were supposed to attain aren't being attained. And instead of like tackling the issue at the producer side, they're basically hiding one of the molecules from the regulation. And in fact, during the development of these technical guidelines, when they were talking about this drinking water regulation, there's two lobby groups that are capable of adding input to the process. So Cefic is there, CropLife is there, a pesticides company, a pesticide lobby is present when they're making this regulation. You have these lobby organizations whispering solutions, and all the solutions are essentially non-solutions, right? Not a single NGO is present, because I think NGOs would have maybe frowned a little bit at what was happening. And it's really, it's a terrible, terrible situation. Yeah.
So it was 2020 when the EU had these ambitious plans to regulate our water. We're 5 years later now, and where do we currently stand?
Yeah, so that parameter is not present in many legislations. The drinking water regulation made a lot of things optional, including this specific PFAS parameter. Once member states started realizing how much PFAS actually was in the water, a lot of them didn't opt for the parameter. They're trying to solve it in two other ways. One of them is that they asked the WHO to make a reassessment of the toxicity of TFA. So they're kind of trying to outsource it. Now, I don't want to get your hopes up. The WHO is going to make an economic assessment. So they're going to look at like what is feasible or not, which means that there's no way there's going to be strong regulation coming out of the WHO or a strong threshold. And maybe the best case scenario is that we'll see that there's a threshold that will get lowered over time, where they say like it has to be that now and then that. And so that's going to be the slow end of those pesticides. So I think that's a relatively likely scenario. The other scenario is UPAC. UPAC is this organization of chemists, an international organization of chemists. And they're trying to redefine what the word PFAS means. So it's really bad, wrong, it's absurd, but it's really true that there's this club of chemists that are saying like, oh, the definition of PFAS is wrong. And why don't we make something that's, better? Now the most amazing thing is that one of the guys leading this effort, this redefinition of PFAS, he has a long running collaboration with Solvay, with one of the companies. So he's got this, this center for research together with Solvay. He even has a PFAS patent. So, my mind was blown when we found that. Is like, we have a scientist that has a direct interest in this industry, and he's trying to redefine the meaning of PFAS. And of course, the idea, and they even spell it out, is that they can use this to influence regulation. Because, if you can change the meaning of the word, then you can change the meaning of the regulation, right? And then there's no problem.
But if you're saying it's so tainted by the industry, I think the central question is, what are the stakes of the industry in this story? What do they stand to lose or gain?
I think the industry stands to lose everything, because TFA is not just a PFAS. It is a PFAS that is connected to pretty much every one of their products. If you make Teflon, and let's say it goes into an incinerator, it's going to create TFA. So you have a waste problem. If you create pesticides, it's going to break down into TFA. If you make cooling gases, it breaks down into TFA. So it's like a core byproduct. It's like the Achilles heel almost of this entire industry. So the problem is, if this thing gets regulated, then it's pretty much game over. It's going to be game over for the pesticide companies first. Now, to be honest, that's an almost, even for me, like, I have a pretty good imagination, but can you imagine that 3 of the largest pesticide producers in Europe would have to stop producing, one of their major products, basically, besides glyphosate, because that's the other thing. It's almost unimaginable. And that's why it's such a scary problem, like, where they put us.
So if I understand you correctly, we have this problem, which is that our water is contaminated. You had these plans to solve the problem. Then they realized the problem was actually much bigger than they originally thought. And instead of adapting the solution, they made the problem go away.
Yeah. They changed the question. That's how you could think about it. Like, what if 120 kilometers per hour is actually the same as 160? Then, what's the problem? That's really what they're doing. Is they're just shifting. They're moving the goal in a way that is spectacular. And I think because it's such a technical subject, and because a lot of people don't know about this, that's why I think they're hoping to get away with this. Is because if you try to read these papers, obviously, like, your mind completely, gives up after 3 sentences, because it's full of chemical names and abbreviations and numbers and this and that. And most people will not do that. But actually, that's one of the things they're simply counting on.
This is not the first time that you've studied the chemical industry lobbying. You've studied it many times before. Is it a classic playbook that you're seeing here?
Yeah, it's definitely something I've studied. It's definitely well described. There's like academic papers on it. They use a couple of techniques, but a couple of things we saw was like getting the right scientists, the industry friendly scientists in the right spaces. So they kind of, make sure that they get an advisory role, maybe in some European commission. They manufacture studies or influence studies, but both happen. So they will work with scientists, but actually behind the screens, it's scientists from the companies themselves that are writing or co-writing these articles. They're inputting the data, so that can be some kind of manipulation there as well. And their main idea is to cause doubt. Because the idea is that if the science is still out, if we don't know enough about PFAS yet, then we can't regulate them. We shouldn't regulate them because that's bad for the economy. That's like the core of the idea. And instead of doing the precautionary thing, they're basically saying, no, you have to prove that it's toxic first. And look at all this evidence that maybe it's not as toxic as you think. So they insert doubt. There's an amazing book about this called Merchants of Doubt. And every chapter basically talks about another case that is almost identical with the same playbook. It'll be like tobacco, plastic recycling, the hole in the ozone layer, and so on and so on. And I think that, especially this TFA issue could just be another chapter in there. It easily could be. And there's a huge industry behind this. There's, PR firms, pseudoscientific companies.
I think it's a familiar story in a way, because that's what the EU does, is that, there's environmental regulation, then there's scientific evidence, but there's still people kind of feel the need to make some kind of compromise. But you can't compromise with scientific evidence. You can't. So you end up doing something which doesn't make a lot of sense based on the evidence, but it makes sense politically. I've seen a similar topic. We did a story once about the methane emissions regulation, where also we ended up finding a lot of like industry language more or less being suddenly introduced by member states in the council. And here again, doesn't make sense science-wise. It makes sense because, the industry would tell regulators they will suffer so much if this would happen.
Yeah, that's exactly what we found.
What I find interesting, you just mentioned that a lot of people, when they read papers on this topic, on PFAS, on TFA, it's a lot of technical language that they might essentially give up. But as I would say, somewhat ignorant citizen, what even happens for me is I read a lot of these headlines about PFAS, but I think because it's not like, I drink water and next day I wake up sick, I realize it's easier to just not worry about it because I don't feel anything anyways.
I think you don't feel it.
Exactly. And I think that's probably the case for a lot of people. So what I would like to ask you is, what is sort of the one thing that you hope that people will take away from your story?
I'm going to say something maybe a little bit controversial, but I think there's this cultural thing about like governmental cover-ups and the industry doing this and that. And it can get very conspirational. People can get very paranoid about that. What I find strange sometimes is that in this case, we have proof. We have very clear proof of this stuff happening. And then people kind of look away and they look for like conspiracies where there's no proof. And so what I would say is like, a lot of people are right in being skeptical about, how the world works politically, but they spend all of their energy chasing ghosts, right? Chasing windmills. And I would say that the big takeaway is that please look at the domains where it's really, really happening and where scientists are saying that it's happening, confirming it, where we have proof. We're talking about climate change, chemical pollution. Like these are the real things you have to focus on. And, I guess that's the best you can take away. The other thing you can take away is that things can change. Some of these companies did stop making PFAS. 3M stopped making PFAS, and that's those guys invented it, right? They literally invented it as one of the first companies. So if they can stop doing it, I think we can have some optimism that there's a world after. It's going to be a world where, yes, these forever chemicals are going to be there forever, but the concentrations will not go up even more.
That's where we'll leave it for today. Thank you so much for joining us, Thomas. If you want to read Thomas's full story, you can find it on ftm.eu, and we'll put the link in the description. And Alex and I will be back soon for another episode.
You've listened to the podcast of Follow the Money. Our watchdog journalism is funded by our members. Subscribe and support European investigative journalism.